Hi, I'm Ralph Parkins, and you're watching Western Bass TV.
I'm Damon Witt with sponsor of BassPro.org, and you're watching Western Bass TV.
Well, good evening and welcome to International Sportsmens Expo Day 2 of our 4-day annual stop here in San Mateo. Those of you gathered around the Cal Boating Aquarium demonstration tank, we want to remind you to wear your life jackets when you're on the water. 4 out of every 10 drownings on the water are anglers, so we want to make sure that you wear those, keep boating safe, and come back to see us again next year. For those of you gathered around our tank, we bring this in, FishingSchool.com out of Lake Fork, Texas. We bring the tank in, fill the tank full of water. Here on loan from the California Department of Fish and Game. These fish are going to be released back into the Delta right after the show's over on Sunday. Where? Who said that? Where I'm going to be fishing in the tournament next week. Why'd you ask? Why do you want to fish for these fish, man? Franceschi's going to educate them so bad, they're not going to bite anything now, you know? They'll be hungry, man, I'm telling you. Several different types of fish in. We've got some crappie, we've got a couple of golden shiner, at least one golden shiner I think left, and some red ear sunfish as well. For those of you here, if you were here last night, you saw Tony's seminar, you'll know that the show closes in an hour and a half, so you pretty much don't have any time left because that's about how long he's going to take. So I hope you guys don't have anything else planned for the rest of the evening. He went a little long into my time yet last night, so it emptied the bleachers. I got to do a seminar to a bunch of empty white chairs over there on the other side. Tony's a longtime friend of mine, a great fisherman on the California Delta. He's a regular competitor on the Everstar Tournament Trail, the Bassmaster Western Opens. He's a West Coast Bass Classic qualifier, a Western Bass Classic qualifier, a Redman Angler of the Year when they had that circuit going out here. And Tony is also kind of known for catching a few big fish. He was the Western Bass record holder, had a big fish in their tournament, was the largest fish that ever weighed in one of their events, a little over 11 pounds. Followed it up the next month with a 10-pounder on the Delta, so he is known for catching a few big fish. Please welcome from Oakley, California, my buddy, Mr. Tony Franceschi.
Oh, I'm sorry, you feel a backlash? I feel
Apparently can't brown using my rods and reels earlier.
Did you see backlash?
No, I'm just picking out the mess you left me.
You know, that's not a good thing to do when you're trying to get closure as possible.
Folks, I want to thank you for coming and spending some time with me tonight. As Ken said, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Delta and techniques that work on the Delta, as well as really how to break the code, solve the puzzle of the Delta. How many people here have fished the Delta before? How many of you haven't fished the Delta but want to go? Okay, there's a few new people to the Delta. Even for those of you that have been fishing the Delta a while, the problem with the Delta is that it's such a large, vast body of water. It's really easy to get lost and turn around on the Delta. And I don't just mean physically lost. I also mean as far as catching fish. A lot of people they get frustrated with the Delta because they go out, and the biggest mistake they make that I see them make is when the first couple of trips to the Delta, people try to run around and see as much water as they can. Well, there's a problem with that. There is so much waterway in the Delta that you cannot learn the Delta in a day. Okay, so consequently what happens is people get out on the water and they just start running, looking for good spots, looking for things that look good, and they run all day long. Well, by the time they get off the water, they fished 1 hour out of the day, they haven't caught anything, and quite frankly, they're a little frustrated. They're telling themselves the Delta is the worst body of water they've ever been on. They don't know how you catch fish on this Delta and everything else. Well, the Delta is by far probably the best body of water in the United States for both quantity and quality of fish. So the trick is not to get frustrated. And really the best piece of advice I can give a fisherman that's going out on the Delta, whether you're new to the Delta or whether you've been on it a few times before but you're just not having the success that you want, is when you launch, before you get to the Delta, grab a map, look at it. Pick an area of the Delta that you want to fish, and it might be just one slough that you notice on the Delta that might look interesting. Launch as close as you can to it, get to that area that you want to fish, drop the trolling motor and forget about the big motor. Just put the trolling motor down and start fishing. Okay, it doesn't matter if the tide is high, low, outgoing, incoming. It does not matter. What's going to happen by doing that is you're going to learn how to fish the Delta in all different kinds of situations. If you have low water, you'll learn how to fish the Delta. If you have high water, you're going to learn how to fish the Delta. So the first, maybe the first trip, the second trip, maybe even the first 3 trips, this is what you should do, and focus on one portion of the Delta. Once you start catching fish in that area and you kind of learn how fish position themselves based on time of day and the level of the water, the height of the water and the tide, you can go and apply that to several other parts of the Delta. And so the first few trips, my recommendation would be pick one spot, fish it hard, fish it all day long, and learn it, no matter what the conditions, and then expand from there. Afterwards, you can expand to a new area, then a new area after that, and eventually you're going to learn how to be successful in several different areas. But you're going to catch a lot more fish doing it right from the get-go. You won't be so frustrated, and you'll be more willing to go to the Delta and spend time with the trolling motor down and exploring it, looking for those areas that are similar that you can catch those fish in. So that's the first thing. Again, it's such a big body of water. I really have to emphasize, don't try to fish it all. Go to an area that looks good, stay in it the first couple of trips that you go out to the Delta, and learn it inside and out. Okay? It's also going to help you learn how the fish position themselves based on the level of the water, the tide, the time of day, etc., even the seasons. And that's going to help you in the long run. It's really going to help you be more successful no matter where you go on the Delta. That's the first piece of advice I can give you. The next piece of advice is a lot of people, the most often asked question I get is, where do I go? Tell me where to fish. Well, I'll tell you, the entire Delta is fertile and has fish all over it. You can catch fish anywhere you go on the Delta. I don't care what part of the Delta you go into. You're in a good spot. Okay? Sure, at any given time it may be a better bite at one part of the Delta versus the other, but if you're fishing on the Delta, you're fishing in a spot that has fish. Fish live there. Okay? So you can rest assured you're fishing good water. So don't get too tied up in trying to figure out where people fish. And kind of to break it down, what you hear a lot about is you hear, oh, I fish the North Delta, or I fish the South Delta, or the West Delta, the East Delta, or the Middle Delta. You hear that a lot coming out of guys' mouths. And really, it's real hard. It's a perception thing. Well, what do you perceive to be the North Delta? What do you perceive to be the West Delta? I'm directionally challenged myself. I don't know North from South, East from West. So that means nothing to me. But so you know what's being talked about, or have a pretty good idea. Basically, the North Delta, when you hear guys talk about the North Delta, it's usually White Slough, Disappointment Slough, Tower Park, that area. Okay, when you hear them talk about the West Delta, they're talking about Big Break, Sherman Island. When you hear them talking about the South Delta, they're talking about Dells, maybe Discovery Bay. When you hear them talk about the East Delta, they're talking about up towards Stockton. The Middle Delta is Frank's Track, Mildred Island. Okay, that kind of gives you an idea when people start talking directionally on the Delta what area they're fishing in. And that might help you in terms of if there's a hot bite in the South Delta, you may know what area to head towards just to kind of get an idea of where people are fishing and where they're catching most of their fish. But again, with that being said, like I said, any part of the Delta you're fishing on is a good part of the Delta. It has fish. You just have to figure them out. And that's really what I'm here to talk a little bit about today, the techniques that work. I'll go through several different techniques, and I'll kind of discuss the times of year that I fish them and how I fish them certain times of year. They're my favorite techniques. By no means are these the only techniques that work, but they're the ones that I like to fish because they work for me day in and day out on the Delta. Okay? As we go along through this, if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. I'd like to try to answer it as the question pops up rather than make you guys wait. So if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll try to make sure I answer the questions for you regarding a particular technique or whatever the question might be. Okay? But the first bait I want to talk about is a spinner bait. Day in, day out, all year long, winter, spring, summer, fall, for numbers, for me, for numbers of fish, a spinner bait is one lure that just can't be beat. Okay, even in the wintertime, you can catch fish on a spinnerbait. If you are throwing a spinnerbait on the Delta, you have a great opportunity at catching bass. So you can't go wrong throwing a spinnerbait any time of year. Now, what I like to do, I always throw it on the same tackle, and I'll go through the tackle first. This happens to be a half-ounce spinnerbait, double willow leaf blade. I typically throw it on 20 to 25 pound test. Heavy line because there's a lot of weeds in the delta and there's a lot of big fish in the delta. And if I hook one of those big fish, I want to make sure I have a good opportunity to get that fish to the boat. I'm using a medium heavy action rod. This happens to be a Lamaglass 705 and a high-speed retrieve reel. This is a 6-to-1 Pflueger President reel. And I like high-speed retrieve reels in all my fishing. You'll probably notice that every time I talk about a reel, it's a high-speed reel. And it has to do with a lot of things. Taking up slack, controlling the fish while you're fighting it. You'll get an idea for that as I go through it. But with spinnerbaits, basically when I'm throwing them, I really have two colors that I like. On the delta, there's a lot of golden shiners. Okay, a lot of golden shiners. So I like to try to imitate golden shiners as much as possible. So typically what I'm going to throw is when I have a spinnerbait like this and I have two blades on it, you'll notice that one is gold and one is silver. I'll either throw a gold and silver combination on the blades or two gold blades. And I'm trying to imitate a golden shiner. As far as a color, I only throw two colors. One is white with a little bit of gold in the skirt. That's what this one is. And one is chartreuse. Those are the only two colors I throw. I'll throw chartreuse if the water is really dirty. I'll throw the white and gold if it's a little clearer. And it's as simple as that. I like to keep my fishing simple. I don't mess around too much when it comes to color because I don't think color makes a big difference. I think it's presentation more so than color. So as far as the spinnerbait's concerned, if I'm throwing it in the wintertime, I'm throwing it early on, I'm going to target the outside edges of weed lines. And let me back up for one moment and just say, anytime I'm fishing the delta, if you're on the delta, and for those of you that fish the delta, there's a lot of stuff out there to look at. You can find tulies, you can find rocks, you can find weeds. I mean, you name it, it's out there. You know, old broken down barges. There's a lot of different things for fish to hang out on. What I like to do is keep it real simple, and the main factor that's going to tell you where those fish are going to be positioned are going to be your weed beds. And when I talk about weed beds, I'm not talking about tulies, I'm not talking about grass on the bank, I'm talking about the weed beds that are off the bank in the water, submerged weed beds. Okay, that is going to tell you where fish are going to be located regardless. Now, when you establish a pattern, you could have a combination of weeds and wood that the fish could be on. And that's great, but the common denominator, the one thing that's always going to be present, is going to be weeds. Okay, so that's what I like to target first. That's what I look for first whenever I start fishing the delta. So in the wintertime, if I'm throwing a spinnerbait and I want to catch fish, I'm going to target the outside edge of the weed line. I'm looking at anywhere from 5 to 8 feet of water, maybe even a little bit deeper, and I'm going to target the outside edges. And I'm going to get my boat as parallel as I can to that weed line, and I'm going to throw that bait out, and I'm going to do what they call slow rolling. And all that is letting that bait fish close to the bottom. And I'm going to reel it as slow as I can. I'm going to bump into wood. I'm going to bump into grass. I'm going to bump into anything I can and just slow roll that bait. And basically what I'm trying to accomplish is as that bait's coming through, it's a nice slow presentation. Fish are lethargic right now, so they're not in a chasing mood. But I'm trying to bump into whatever I can, whether it be the weeds, whether it be wood. And the reason for that is because anytime this bait changes direction or changes its action even a little bit, it's going to trigger a strike. What we're trying to do is make fish react, okay, because they're very lethargic. In the wintertime, bass will feed less than any other time of year because of the cold water temperatures. So again, I'm throwing that out on the outside edge of the weed line, and I'm just slow rolling that bait. I want to make sure that those blades are turning, and I might pop the rod a little bit to get that bait to come over any obstruction it might encounter, and that'll cause it to jump and change direction, and fish should react to that. Okay, so it's a real slow way of fishing. It's a real slow presentation, and the key is to make sure that you're feeling those blades turning on your rod all the time. Okay? Well, two things can happen. If you don't feel your blades anymore, one of two things happens. Either your blade's loaded up with weeds and it stopped turning, or a fish has grabbed the bait. And in the wintertime, sometimes a fish can grab this bait so subtly that it'll feel like weeds. It's not a hard jerking strike like you would get in warmer times of the year. So this time of year, I'm feeling for those blades. I want to feel them turning as I'm retrieving that bait. And if for any reason it stops, I'm going to jerk that rod, almost like a hook set. If there's no fish there, no harm, no foul. What happens is the weeds pop off the blade because you snap the rod, and the weeds will explode off the blade, and you should feel your blade start turning again. If it's a fish, and you snap that rod, you're going to hook that fish. You've caught that fish. But if you don't snap that rod and there's a fish on the end of your line, you're pretty much going to lose that fish. You're going to lose that opportunity. Okay, so When you're throwing a spinnerbait, again, I like to target outside weed lines, keep it real simple, slow roll retrieve, anywhere from 5 to 8 feet of water, maybe down to 10 feet of water, and I'm trying to imitate a golden shiner. Now, as the water warms up and these fish start moving to the bank, all right, we're getting into the springtime, fish will start moving to the bank looking for spawning areas and looking to feed real heavily to get ready. What I'm going to do then is now I'm going to target the inside portion of the weed line, the side of the weed line that's closest to the bank. And what I'm going to do at that point is I'm going to throw this bait right on the bank in about 2 inches of water. And so I'm going to cast this to the bank, it hits 2 inches of water, and I'm going to immediately snap the rod to get the blades turning and start retrieving that bait. And now I'm going to retrieve it a little faster, okay? I'm only going to let that bait get about 1.5 to 2 feet under the water as I retrieve it. So I'm hitting the bank, snapping the rod tip, and getting that thing to turn. Now, because these fish are positioned so shallow at this time of year in the spring, because they're on that inside weed line, especially when they're feeding, there's two things that are happening. They're either sitting on the inside edge of the weed line, looking to the bank, waiting for something to eat, or they're in an area where they think they're going to be spawning and they're protecting that area. Regardless, if something enters their area that they either don't want there or they want to eat, they're going to react immediately. So that's the reason I want that blade turning as soon as it gets to the bank. So I'm going to throw the bait up to the bank, snap the rod tip, get the blade turning, and start reeling. And it's real important that you pay attention, because the first 2 turns of your reel handle is when that fish is going to bite. Okay? You throw up in a couple inches of water, and the minute that spinner bait starts turning, first 2 cranks of the reel handle, you're going to see a swirl in shallow water. That fish is going to try to attack that bait. So in the springtime, I'm targeting really shallow water. I'm targeting the inside weed lines where there's only 1.5 to 2 feet, maybe 3 feet of water at best on the inside weed line. And typically your strikes are going to be within the first 5 feet of the bank. From the bank out 5 feet. That's typically when those strikes are going to come. Now, as summertime comes in, you can still catch a lot of fish on the spinnerbait. But again, these fish are starting to move to the outside edges of the weed lines. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the outside edges, just like I did in wintertime, but instead of slow rolling it, I'm going to have a moderate retrieve. Okay, these fish might be a little deeper. I'm going to have a moderate retrieve. I'm going to let this bait get down about 3 feet, 4 feet, and that's about it. And it's just a moderate, steady retrieve. And at times, as I'm retrieving that bait, I may snap the rod tip a little bit, pause, and then start reeling again. Snap the rod tip a little bit, pause, and then start reeling again. This does 2 things, okay? If you have a fish that's interested and it's following the spinnerbait, the minute you start jerking it and it starts reacting real funny, it looks to the fish like that bait fish is getting scared and it's trying to get away, and it causes the fish to react. So that oftentimes triggers a strike. Remember, pretty much everything I'm going to talk about in this seminar is about triggering the fish to strike. Okay? So that's the first thing it does. A change in direction will trigger the fish. The second thing it does is, as you shake this rod tip, as you jerk the rod tip and pause, what happens is this bait will jump around and these 2 blades will click together. They'll knock together. And it causes some noise. So now not only do you have vibration and flash of the blades that are attracting the fish, but you've got some noise included as well. And sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes that's what it takes to trigger a fish into biting. Sometimes it's just something a little bit different. Now when we get back into the fall is my favorite time of year to throw the spinnerbait. If I could pick one bait to fish in the fall, it would be the spinnerbait. And what I like about the fall is now I'm still targeting the same weed beds, and I'm going to go a little bit shallower. But now I'm looking for sparse weed beds. I'm looking for weed beds that are broken up a little bit, that aren't one consistent weed bed anymore. There may be a patch, then there may be about a 2 or 3 foot opening, then another patch, etc. It's all broken up. And what I want to do with the spinnerbait at that point is I'm going to throw it past those patches, and now I'm going to keep that spinnerbait just at the surface. So that blade is creating a wake on the surface. Okay? And you really have to play with it to find out what speed the fish want it at. Based on the size of the blade, it determines on how fast you have to reel it to keep that bait just under the surface and bulging that water, making that water wake. A bigger blade enables you to reel the bait in slower. A smaller blade makes you reel the bait in faster to keep it up on the surface and bulging the water. In the fall, I prefer a fast retrieve, so I go to smaller blades. And again, what this does is these fish are in isolated pockets in the weeds that are just sitting there. When that spinnerbait comes flying by at a fast pace, they got to make up their mind. They either eat it or they let it go. And a bass being a predatory fish, most of the time they're going to eat it. It's just zipping through, and they got to make a snap decision. So again, you're triggering a strike. So once again, I'm throwing it out there. I'm reeling it just fast enough to make that bait wake at the surface of the water, and I want to try to keep that blade from breaking the surface. If the blade breaks the surface and stops rotating, the fish don't like that. I don't catch fish when that happens on retrieves like that. When that blade is just waking the surface and it's just underneath that water and making it bulge, that's when the fish are going to attack it. And what's so unique about it is it's like a buzzbait, but it's not making the racket that a buzzbait makes. Buzzbaits are great baits, but at least in the last 2 or 3 years, a lot of people are throwing them. The fish are getting conditioned to them, so something a little more subtle often triggers bigger fish to bite versus throwing the same bait that everybody else is throwing and making a racket. So again, fall is probably one of my favorite times to throw a spinnerbait, simply because it's a fast retrieve and you can actually see the fish come up and actually eat the spinnerbait when it does it. So it's a really fun way to catch fish. That's about it for spinnerbaits. I like to keep my fishing simple and enjoy it. I don't get too complicated with colors and everything else. So it's a real simple way, real simple technique, and I look at it in a very simple way. It's a good question. The question is, do I use a trailer on it? In the fall, when I'm waking the bait, I use a trailer hook. I don't ever add a trailer to my spinnerbait. Most of the spinnerbaits I use, you can see, have this mylar strip in it. There's a little flash to it, and it's usually cut a little bit longer than the skirt, so it serves as a built-in trailer. So I will rarely put a trailer on my spinnerbaits. Do the tides affect finding the weed beds? That's a good question. The question is, do the tides affect finding the weed beds? And the answer is yes, it can. If you have an extremely high tide, the weed beds are going to be harder to see. As the water drops down, you'll be able to see them. They'll usually bunch up and start laying over, and they're a lot easier to see. So that's a real good question. But even on a high tide, you can usually find weeds, sparse weed beds. And you know, there's different levels of weeds, basically. Different levels of weed grow throughout the delta. So it's one of those things where if you're not comfortable fishing over the tops of weeds when the tide is high and you want to see more of a visual weed bed, you can actually look for one and you'll be able to find one. But the tide definitely can affect finding the weeds on the delta in certain areas. Now, past spinnerbait fishing, another very productive bait to throw on the delta is crankbait, and there's a couple different versions I like to throw. This particular crankbait is what they call a Twin Vibe 65, made by River to Sea, and they have them here at the show. If you guys get a chance, check them out. But this bait has been a hot bait lately. A lot of fish being caught on this bait, a lot of tournaments being won, checks cast in tournaments with this bait. And again, it's a rattle style bait. Creates a lot of commotion, has a very tight wiggle, and creates a lot of vibration in the water. So, and it's a bait that we're trying to trigger the fish with. We want to trigger some strikes on this bait. You'll notice this bait is gold. I like to use either a gold tone to my rattle baits, or a red tone. This also has a red back, or a red tone. The two things I'm trying to imitate in the delta are either crayfish, crawdads, or golden shiners. And that's what I'm trying to imitate. Those are the main forage on the delta. Now, with this crankbait, you hear a lot about rods that are used for crankbaits, and there was a fiberglass craze for a while, and in many cases there still is. A lot of people use fiberglass. I use a graphite rod, especially with a vibrating bait like this. And main reason is because you want the feel. You want to feel the bait vibrating. This happens to be a 7-foot Lamaglass graphite rod. I use about 15 pound. This is 15-pound P-Line CX premium line. And again, a high-speed Pflueger President reel. High speed is real key in this type of fishing. Now, the key to the rod is that you can see this rod kind of bends throughout the entire rod, not just at the tip. It doesn't have a fast tip. This is what we call a slow reacting rod. And you want that for crankbaits because of the type of hook that you have on your baits. You're less likely to pull a hook out of a fish's mouth with a slow reacting rod. Okay, but you want the feel, and you want the fast action or the fast action of graphite when you fish this bait for a couple of reasons. The main way I fish this bait, and really the seasons I like to fish this bait, are summer and fall. This is really when I like this bait the most. And again, in the summer I'm targeting outside weed lines, and even in the fall I'm targeting outside weed lines. If I feel the fish are on the outside of the weed lines in about anywhere from 4 to 6 feet of water, I'm going to throw this bait. And this bait is made to be retrieved fast. Okay, it's a sinking bait, and it's got a very fast, tight wobble when you reel it in. And you can't hear it, but it's got tungsten BBs in here that are just rattling like crazy as it comes through the water. Now what I'm trying to do when I'm throwing this bait is, on this outside weed line, I want to do a couple of things. Number one, it's going to be a steady retrieve. But it's going to be a steady retrieve until I get down into those weeds. Now, what I typically try to do is I try to make that bait get loaded up with weeds. I want it to get loaded up with weeds, okay? I don't want to let it sink down in the weed bed, but I want it to come across the top and start getting loaded up with weeds. What happens is, as I feel that bait getting loaded up with weeds, I'm going to take this fast rod and I'm going to snap it like that, real hard, okay? This does a couple of things. When there's weeds on the bait and you snap the rod like that, the weeds will explode off the bait, and that bait will explode out of the weeds and just take off real fast. When that happens, it's triggering fish, okay? The fish see the movement, they're kind of curious, they're sitting there looking at it, the weeds are moving, and then all of a sudden this thing comes darting out of the weeds like it's trying to get away. Once again, that fish has got to make a decision. It either eats it or it lets it get away. And hopefully, being a predatory fish, it's going to eat that bait. So if you got that bait anywhere close, when you throw that thing out, you throw that bait out, you're reeling it in at a decent retrieve, it's about 3-4 feet deep, gets loaded up with weeds, you snap the rod tip, and that thing explodes out of the weeds. Weeds will just pop right off the thing. If you had a fiberglass rod, you would not be able to do that, because fiberglass doesn't react. When you snap a fiberglass rod, it stays bent. Okay, it doesn't pull the bait like you want it to. You want some shock on the bait so the weeds explode off of it. Okay, same thing in the fall, summer and fall. I do the same thing. I target outside weed lines. I'm retrieving this, trying to get it loaded up with weeds, and then when I snap that rod, it explodes, and that's when that fish is going to bite. Okay, real simple way of fishing, but real effective. Catch a lot of fish on this bait, and a lot of big fish. You'd be surprised on how big a fish you can catch throwing this little crankbait. Are there any questions regarding a rattling bait? Okay. The other type of crankbait I like to throw is, again, a fast-moving shad imitating or crawdad imitating crankbait. This little one happens to be a snub crank. This is, again, made by River to Sea, and it's made to be retrieved extremely fast. It's got a tight wobble, has a lot of vibration to it, and as you're retrieving it fast, it's pretty erratic. As it's coming through the water, it may dart off to the side, and then it comes back to center, and it darts from side to side a little bit. So it's a pretty erratic bait. And it's made to be retrieved at a pretty good pace, a pretty good clip. You get a lot of a very tight action out of it, very tight wiggle, and you can feel it through the rod tip. And this bait doesn't go very deep. So what I'm targeting with this is, I typically throw this crankbait on, let's say, a high tide, when I know that the weeds are going to be a couple of feet under the water, and I'm throwing this bait over the top of those weeds, and I'm reeling it pretty fast. And once again, it's just a reaction. This bait's coming through real fast, and it's darting a little bit from side to side. And as that thing flies by the fish have to make a decision. Once again, triggering. That's the key to getting fish to bite on the delta, is triggering. Getting fish to bite anywhere. The key is to trigger them into biting. Make them react. So again, this little bait only dives to about 3 feet maximum. It's made for a pretty fast retrieve and a very tight wiggle. And it's really a simple way to fish, because it's really just a steady retrieve. I don't put any other action into it except what it gives itself. Okay? And again, a lot of fish. You catch a lot of fish reeling this bait fast. Not a slow, medium retrieve like a lot of people do when they throw crankbaits. Most people throw it out there and fish it nice and slow. And in some cases, that's a great way to fish a crankbait. But when you're fishing on the delta with these baits, especially in the warmer months, you want a fast retrieve. It's going to get them to react. Okay? I'm sorry? The name of the lure is a snub. It's called a snub crank, and it's made by River to Sea. Snub. Yeah, S-N-U-B. It's made by River to Sea. Again, I like red crawdad colors or gold colors just because I'm trying to imitate the natural forage, and they only make one size in that bait. And it's a very fast, erratic bait. It's a great bait on the bass on the delta. Any other questions regarding crankbait fishing? Okay, pretty simple way to fish. No, the question is this too deep for the delta? What this is What this is, this happens to be a bomber model A. I think this is a number 6 or 7A. It's got a bigger bill on it. It's a little deeper diving bait. This is not too deep for the Delta. A lot of times, especially in the summer, this bait probably on an average cast is going to go down to about 8 feet, 6 to 8 feet. Okay, that can be a very good bait when the fish are deeper in hot weather. Caught a lot of fish on a bomber as well. A lot of fish. So no, answer your question, is not too deep. It does not go too deep. Senkos. How many of you have heard of Senkos? Okay. Senko is really one of the ugliest baits I think I've ever seen. It is just a nothing bait. It looks like a pen, and as a matter of fact, I believe that's what it was modeled after, as a pen. Basically, this bait is just a plastic worm. There's no action to it. There's no curl tail to it. There's no special things to it. You rig it on a 4/0 hook just like you would a regular plastic worm. There's a couple different ways to rig it. I like to rig it Texas style, which means you bury the hook back in the worm and make it weedless. And this bait is extremely easy to fish because when you cast it out, you don't do anything with it. You just let it sink. It has a natural presentation. It just looks like an injured bait fish that's just floating down. That's just sinking. Okay. Now, as far as the equipment that I use 15 to 20 pound test, usually CX premium, high visibility line, because typically all the fish you catch on this bait, I would venture to say more than 90% of the fish you catch on this bait, you're going to see the strike before you feel it. You're going to see your line move, all right, when the fish hits. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. The rod I'm using is a Lamiglass Senko Special, specifically made for fishing Senkos. It has a fast tip, but a lot of backbone so you can really set the hook on a fish. The fast tip allows you to cast a bait with no weight. Okay, it gives you a little bit of action to the rod. Again, 6-to-1 Fluger President reel to take up slack, set the hook, control the fish. Okay, a lot of retrieve speed there. What I do with this bait is I use this as a target bait. I may be going down the bank, I may see a little pocket in the weeds that I want to fish. I think a fish might be in it. I'll pitch that bait to the pocket, and then I'll give it slack, and I'm just going to let it sink straight down. The key is to let this bait sink straight to the bottom. If you keep a tight line once you cast this bait and hold on to it, that bait is going to come towards you. You see that bait's not sinking straight down. That's an unnatural look to a bass. That doesn't look natural. A dying bait fish doesn't swim that way, doesn't act that way. It usually just floats straight down. We're making it look like a bait fish that doesn't have the strength to try to run away, is what it is. So when I throw that out there, when I throw that bait to where I want it, I'm going to give it slack, and I'm just going to let it sink as straight down as I can. You can see my line is just laying on the water. And what you do with this bait is you let it sink to the bottom, and you watch your line where it enters the water. Okay? Where your line enters the water, that's where you want to keep that's where your eyes want to be. You want to watch that line as it enters the water. If you get a strike, you're going to see that line jump. It's going to tick. Just jump. If you see that fish has that bait, swing on it, set the hook. Reel down up the slack and set the hook. Now, if you get to the bottom and you still have no bite, what I like to do is, a lot of times fish are lethargic, and sometimes they'll pick that bait up and they won't be aggressive, and they'll just sit there with it in their mouth. And if you don't happen to see the strike, then you could miss that fish. So what I'll try to do is, if it's sitting on the bottom and I didn't see a strike, I'll pick my line up, just give it a little bit of slack, feel if there's any tightness to see if a fish has it. If it doesn't, I'll lift it up, let it sink back down one last time. And if I don't get bit, I reel that thing in, and I go to the next spot, pitch it in. It's a real simple way to fish. You just let that bait sink straight down. There's nothing to it. You can target wood, you can target tule pockets, you can target, weed bed pockets with it. Wherever you think there's going to be a fish, just throw it in and let it sink. It's that easy. Okay, I can't get into it much more than that, because that's really how easy it is. As far as colors go, I like to stick with natural colors, browns, greens, shad color. That's about it. Okay, I don't get too crazy with colors. I like to keep it simple. So, that one thing I will recommend is on a Senko, stick with a round bend hook. Don't use a wide gap hook. There's what they call a wide gap hook that has a real deep throat to it. For those of you that have used those, on a Senko, I think you lose a few fish using a wide gap hook. And the reason is just because of the angle that the point of the hook sits once you embed it in the worm. With a round bent hook, that point is a little, not quite parallel. It's open a little bit, and I think you get a little bit better hook set on the fish. So I've lost a lot of fish on wide gap hooks fished with Senko, so I just don't use them anymore. I use the round bend, typical round bend hook. Any questions on Senkos at all? Okay, real simple bait, real easy to fish, but catches a ton of fish all year long. Now, the next thing I'm going to get into, and probably I feel most comfortable on the Delta any time of year when I have this rod in my hand, and it's basically a flipping stick, okay? If I have a flipping stick in my hand with a flip bait, whether it's a crawdad, whether it's a jig, whether it's a plastic worm, whatever the case may be, whatever I'm flipping, if I have a flipping stick in my hand, that's when I'm most comfortable. I feel like I can catch fish all year long, any time of year, and big fish with a flipping stick in my hand. And basically what flipping is, for those of you that are new to it, flipping is instead of casting, you're just using the rod to propel the bait out there. It's a pendulum swing. It's kind of like fly fishing. You control the line in this hand, you pendulum swing the bait out, let the line out, and just drop it in the water. The advantages to it is you can place a bait precisely by just flipping it out there. You can put it wherever you want to put it. Okay? And you have a low trajectory to the water, so when the bait enters the water, you have less of a splash than if you were casting overhand. Okay? Now, pitching is also a part of flipping, and if you have a long distance and you can't quite make it with your flipping, like so, say I want to get to the end of the tank, you can use the reel with the same pendulum swing and just pitch it out to get it further out, all the way to where you want it to be. You can get it all the way to the end of the tank versus flipping, I can only get it halfway to the tank. Okay? Now, again, this is a technique that's made for close-in fishing. You're usually not more than 30 or 40 feet from the fish you're catching because you're in close and you're making precise flips. Okay? And because of that, it's also made, because it can be so precise, it's also made to be fishing heavy cover, heavy wood, heavy tules, heavy grass, whatever the case may be. So because of that, a flipping stick, or when you're using the flipping technique, you want heavy line. I never go under 25-pound test. Once again, this is 25-pound P-line CX Premium high visibility line. Once again, a 6-to-1 Fluger President reel, fast retrieve reel, and I'm using a heavy action 7.5-foot flipping stick. There's also 8-foot flipping sticks. It's really personal preference. I prefer 7.5-foot flipping stick. A lot of people like the 8-foot flipping stick. They say it gives them more leverage. I don't know if that's true or not. When you're 30 feet from a fish, I don't know that 6 more inches on a rod is going to give you all that much more leverage. But if you like an 8-foot flipping stick, fine. So there's 2 sizes you use. And it's really made to pull fish out of heavy cover and get them to the boat fast. So the bait that I have here has actually very quickly become one of my favorite baits. I used to flip a jig probably 90% of the time. Okay, and a jig is basically lead head with a hook, a skirt, and you put some kind of trailer on the back end of it. Okay? That's typically what I use about 90% of the time. Well, recently I've been flipping this. This is, again, made by River to Sea. It's called a Yabi. And it's a crawdad, but this crawdad bait, there's a lot of crawdad baits out there, but this crawdad bait resembles a crawdad better than any bait I've ever thrown. It is the most natural looking crawdad bait I've ever seen. When a crawdad's on the bottom and a fish is coming up to it, it gets in a defensive posture. What it does is it kind of stands up on its hind legs or its hind end and raises its claws up to protect itself. I have never seen a bait do that as well as this bait does. And I'll throw it in the middle of the tank a little bit, let it sink to the bottom so you guys can get an idea what it looks like. But those claws stand straight up. It's standing on its tail, those claws stand straight up. And every time you move that, the claws tend to stand up again. Just like a crawdad in a defensive posture. Okay? And it's a natural look to these fish. And it's a way that their natural forage reacts anytime that they move up on it or they're coming up to it, looking at it as a potential meal. And that's what we want to imitate. So this bait has really quickly become one of my favorites. And what I'll do is, again, I'm going down, and depending on the time of year, once again, kind of the seasonal patterns. If I can break it down for you, in the wintertime, I'm looking at the outside of the weed beds, a little bit deeper water. In the springtime, when they're moving up to spawn, I'm going to get back in shallow. I'm going to go to the inside weed bed line, one close to the bank. In the summertime, as it gets hot, they move back to the outside. In the fall, they move up shallow, and they could kind of spread out from the outside to the inside of the weed line. So that's kind of the seasonal pattern, and that's what I follow. It gives you a rule of thumb, and it could be different from day to day, but it gives you a starting point to look at when you hit the delta. So what I'm going to do, especially in the wintertime, is I'm going to fish those outside weed lines, and I'm looking for slow-moving water. I want to get in dead-end sloughs, the back ends of marinas, where there's not a lot of current, because these fish don't want to be fighting current. And I'm going to fish the outside edges of weed lines. I'm going to fish 6-8 feet of water, let this thing sink to the bottom. I'm going to let it sit a little bit. I'm going to move it real slow. I'm going to move it real slow. You can see that fish just turned on it. I mean, this thing looks like a crawdad like nothing else I've ever seen. Okay? It's a natural acting bait. You can see these fish reacting to it right now. So again, in the wintertime, I'm going to the outside weed lines. I'm letting it sink to the bottom. I'm moving it real slow and letting these fish have a chance to look at it. Now, as spring moves on, these fish are going to move to the bank. Now I'm going to look for tules. I'm going to look for pockets of tules with weeds on the outside, that type of wood, flooded wood on the bank that has weeds on the outside. And I'm going to fish to the open. I'm going to flip to the open pocket. So I'm fishing in real shallow water at that point. At that point, it's kind of a reaction. I'm letting that bait hit the bottom, and I'm going to pick it up once, maybe hop it 2 times. If I don't get bit, I'm bringing it in and I'm flipping it to the next target. Okay? It's a fast way to fish, because these fish, it's warmer weather, warmer water, and these fish are going to be a little more active and should react a little bit better to the bait. Now, as summer comes in, there's a thing that's a little unique with flipping. How many of you have trout fish? A few of you. Okay? So you know about, in trout fishing, you're fly fishing in a river, you throw upstream and you let the thing naturally come down with the current, right? Same thing on the delta for bass, only you're using real heavy equipment. I'm going to get on the outside of the weed line. I'm going to find a good weed line, one with some irregularities to it. Not just a straight weed line, but one that's got a little bit of some points, some pockets. That's what I'm looking for. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to face the boat into the current. I'm going to go up this weed line. I'm going to get fairly close to it. And I'm going to flip this bait out ahead of the boat, right on that weed line. And I'm going to give the bait slack, okay, because, again, I want it to fall naturally. Now, because of that, there's going to be current sweeping across that weed line, that bait is not going to fall straight to the bottom. It's going to get pushed back along that weed line with the current. Now, the key here, much like fly fishing, is to control your slack as that bait is being pushed towards you.